Welcome to Josie to Lagos. This is an African podcast from Africa by Africa. Why? Because we need this kind of content. Aren't you tired of just hearing about Africa in snippets by people who either don't understand it, don't live in it, or don't get what's happening? Aren't you tired of scraping around the internet for Africa content? If you're like me, you're in the right place. We're going to talk about Africa. We're going to analyze it properly. We're going to make sure that we come out of every conversation more informed. Josie to Lagos is all about that. It's all about that conversation, making sure that Africa comes alive to everyone who lives on this continent. I'm passionate about that. I'm passionate about this show. And we're going to have an interesting conversation today. My name is Mighty Jamie. And I work in a variety of spaces, but one of those spaces that I work in is as a political and economic analyst in mainstream media, as well as just free media, like a podcast such as this one. So if I swear, please accept my apologies. That's not the intention to offend you or to take you to a place where your ears may find offensive, but it may happen. So be aware of that. So today we're talking about economic systems. Now, economic systems underpin the whole arrangement that we live in, and we don't pay enough attention to them as Africa. I've watched elections, and in fact, last year I had a YouTube channel where I was covering elections. And in my coverage of elections, one of the things I noticed being peculiar was that the economic systems underpinning the manifestos were not being sufficiently discussed. Because what you must remember is that behind that manifesto is an economic system that is being articulated for. And that economic system comes with ideas and concepts that are normative behind it, which need to be examined. I remember when I most noticed this was when I was looking at the Nigeria election last year. You had Buhari on the one side, the incumbent, and then you had Atiku coming in to almost upset the incumbent possibly, and the narrative was about these two men, their histories, and who had the energy to take Nigeria forward. But there wasn't enough of a conversation around the economic systems that they were arguing and articulating. And I found that to be peculiar. And I've been observing that we don't pay enough attention to this particular question. So this episode will try to do that. It will try to look at the different economic systems that exist, look at how we found ourselves in the current position that we're in as Africa, and then try to unpack which of those economic systems we ought to prefer. So that's where we're going. That's what this episode is about. Having laid that out, I think the best place to start off with to show you the problem that we have when we don't actually examine and design our own economic systems comes from watching how COVID-19 played out. COVID-19 exposed a lot of governance failures and inefficiencies in Africa, and we were found to be incapable of having the sufficiency to handle our own business. Part of that is because of economic system design. So one of the challenges that African states had when COVID-19 hit is that they could not take the approach that was taken by many other countries of using a bailout system for the public. So what we saw in America was that Congress met, they drafted a stimulus package, Senate passed it, and people got money in a short space of time. Canada did the same thing. The United Kingdom did the same thing. New Zealand, Australia. Basically, they went to their reserve banks and they were like, listen, you need to do what we call quantitative easing, but it's printing money. We need to do that, and we need to get money into the hands of people. So that's what happened. But Africa couldn't do that. And the reason why they couldn't do that is because our currencies are not truly our own. Our currencies are supervised. And if you fall out of the frame of the supervision, you can have a lot of challenges. So here's what African countries faced. If they printed money, they were going to have a situation where their currency was going to be devalued on international markets. The way that happens is if people start getting worried about your currency, they sell it on the market. And if the market gets flooded with your currency, the number of people willing to buy it decreases. So the value of that currency on the resale market decreases, and that affects your buying power when you are trying to import goods and services from around the world. So we've seen that happen many times in Africa where political decisions are made and then the international community gets nervous, the value of the currency goes down. But attached to that, adjacent to that, is that if your perception is viewed as being negative, not only does your currency go down, but your capacity to borrow at good interest rates actually goes down too, because you will have a rating agency review your borrowing capacity and downgrade you. The funny thing is that if you looked at America, they printed out trillions of US dollars to give to the American people. They were not devalued by any rating agency because they view that as a necessary stimulus. But if South Africa had done the same thing and said, listen, we're going to print out 500 billion and we're going to give it to the people, and the people are going to stay at home, they're going to be fed, and we're going to manage this virus, what would have happened is the rand would have dropped from 1:18 to 1:30, and then it would have been so expensive for South Africa to import COVID-19 drugs and PPE from China that all of the printing that they would have done would have been cancelled out by the doubling of prices in the shops. So that's the balancing act that everyone has to worry about when they are navigating the space. So you don't have the agency. Now you have to go, if you can't print your own money, you have to go borrow it from the IMF or the World Bank. And if you go do that, now you've got a double problem. Number one, you probably had already borrowed money from them. So now you are adding to your debt load. So after COVID-19, you will owe more than you did going in. But secondary to that is that these debts come with interest rates. And these interest rates are not necessarily the best for Africa. They are low in some instances, but they are still high enough to cause a lot of pain when it's time to repay. So you don't get interest-free loans. You get these interest-attached loans. And now when you have to pay back, a lot of the money of your future budgets now goes towards servicing COVID-19 debt. So there's a double whammy there. And that you don't actually have the agency to control how you respond to the crisis. The third thing is that some economies simply don't even have enough money, even if we're not talking about the printing of the money, just in terms of like revenue earning capacity outside of COVID-19 to be able to respond fully. You know, you see some countries are unable to pay their doctors, they're unable to pay their nurses, they're unable to procure the implements that they need, and they didn't do the work they needed to do to make sure everything was set up from the beginning. But I'm not telling you the COVID-19 story to illustrate that there've been bad governments in Africa. You already know that, and we'll have those conversations in future episodes. I'm telling you the story to show you that if you do not have economic control of your system, when a disaster strikes, such as a national emergency or this kind of a crisis like COVID-19, it could even be a natural disaster. It could be locusts, it could be floods, and some African countries have been facing these challenges as we speak. Some countries have had more people dying from other diseases than COVID-19. So for instance, more than 6,000 people have died of malaria in the DRC in the last year alone. So they were already dealing with a different crisis with malaria. But if you add to that, you add malaria, you add Ebola, you add COVID-19, they may need to have more agency in their economic system to be able to withstand those internal and external shocks. But unfortunately, they simply do not have that agency as things exist right now. That's the problem that exists in Africa, and that's the problem that makes everyone aware, or rather should make everyone aware, that we need to be cognizant of the economic system we're designing. The reason why we were struck so hard in COVID-19 is because the economic systems that we are part of have us at the bottom of the pyramid, not at the top. So we are the ones who are supplying the world with raw materials, with human capital, and also we are supplying the world with a market, but we don't benefit from the high-end benefication that they do. So Germany comes and sells us its cars, China comes and sells us its clothes, textiles, etc. But we are unable to return to those very same markets with the same kinds of products and actually benefit from them. So we're suffering, and the reason why we're suffering that we're going to explore could actually be related to the economic systems that we've chosen. So let's go into economic systems discussion. Let's define an economic system. An economic system is a particular set of institutional arrangements and a coordinating mechanism to respond to the economy and the economizing problem. This is what the economists will tell you in Econ 101. And this, for those of you who are doing that, is a recap. What do we talk about when we're talking about these things? Now, economics is based on two main principles. Number one, society's materials are limited. And number two, the material wants are unlimited. So the materials that you can provide to the people are limited, but their material wants are unlimited. So this then leads for a discussion around how do we then organize the economy. And there are some questions which are involved in trying to organize an economy. These are the economizing problem responses, right? Number one, what goods are produced? How are they produced? Number two. Number three, who gets them? Number four, how do we accommodate change when there is change in the system? And number five, how do we promote technological progress? These are the 5 core questions of an economic system, and they are responded to differently based on how you design your economy. But the goal of both of these, the goal of an economic system is to achieve what is called allocative and productive efficiency. Allocative efficiency means that the resources that are used for producing the combinations of goods and services are in such a way that the goods and services most wanted by society are produced. So for instance, now we would want to have more smartphones versus typewriters because we are not necessarily in need of typewriters. So if there was an economic system that led to the production of typewriters over smartphones, we would actually say that system does not have allocative efficiency. A different example is one that actually would look at where do you think allocative efficiency exists if we were to produce alcohol-based hand sanitizer or produce more Hunter's Dry, which is a brand of alcohol that is consumed in SADC. Most people would agree allocative efficiency would extend towards the production of more alcohol-based hand sanitizer than more Hunter's Dry. That's an example of allocative efficiency. Productive efficiency, on the other hand, is all about having those resources produced at the lowest possible cost using the best techniques available at the time. So what you're trying to do is make what the people want and make it in the best way possible. That's the aim of an economic system, right? Allocative efficiency, productive efficiency. If both are achieved, that economy is considered to be at full production. So the whole game of economics is to try to hit full production and to design a system that accomplishes that. So let's start by looking at 2 polar opposites. Number 1, the command system, and number 2, the market system. The command system is the same one that you would often hear referred to as socialism. And sometimes people are talking about communism as well. There's different iterations here and there, but the fundamentals are the same. And we're going to look at an interesting case study in the command system to show its inefficiencies and what kind of problems can arise. The command system is also, as I've said, known as socialism. The word command actually tells you everything you need to know about the system. The government is commanding the people on what to do. So it's called a planned system because the government controls the central planning. All of the allocative planning is done at a government level. You oftentimes have a central planning board appointed by the government, and it makes all of the major decisions concerning the use of resources, composition and distribution of output. And government owns most of the firms, and the government owns most of the property and the resources that are being used within the state. Some prominent and popular examples of command economies are the Soviet Union and Cuba. So the Soviet Union was a command economy. Obviously now we have Russia and not the Soviet Union, but back when it existed, that was a command economy. There have been some new examples of command economy efforts, and the one that I want to reference to you guys right now is the example of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, interestingly enough, performed a command economy strategy, and we can actually make an assessment of how effective that strategy was. So in 2016, the government of Zimbabwe unveiled this program, which was called the Spatial Grain and Oilseed Program. And to simplify, they actually called it command agriculture. The principles of it were based on a socialist planning model. It was a command economy type of approach. So now they allocated $3 billion to make sure that they could actually resuscitate their grain production in Zimbabwe. The aim was to meet the annual requirement for human consumption and livestock feed. And we're going to look at specifically maize production, because maize is the staple food in Zimbabwe and it's had for most meals. It's had for porridge in the morning, for lunch, for dinner, as pap. If you are living in Southern Africa, you would know what pap is. The target was to produce more than 2 million tons of maize every year to be able to meet the monthly demand, but also to be able to maintain a strategic reserve of 500,000 tons. So the way that the plan worked is that there were several things that were going to be done. One, supporting irrigated and dry land farmers. So there are some farmers who irrigate, some who just rely on the rain. Number two, to produce 2 million tons of corn, they were going to make sure that they implement the program and distribute to every farmer who was participating a full production input package, which would include seed, fertilizers, chemical, and fuel to plant a specific area for maize or corn, if you will. Now, after harvesting the maize, the farmers would then have an obligation to deliver the specified corn tonnage to the Grain Marketing Board, which is the central grain distributor in Zimbabwe. And that would serve as repayment for the loan. And then they would sell a different portion, if they will, to the marketing board or on the private market. Now, the outcome of this was as follows. In 2014, just to give you a comparison, because remember the program starts in 2017. In 2014, there were 1.3 million tons of maize produced. In 2016, there were 500,000 tons of maize produced. When the program began excellently on a high note. It was a rainy season. 2.2 million tons of maize were produced by Zimbabwe, and it was a significant increase from the 2016 production output of 500 tons. In fact, it was a 400% increase. Just think about that. 400% increase in 1 year. Surely Command Agriculture was working and working phenomenally. The problem is, in 2018, the result was 1.7 million tons. It's a decrease. And then when you go further down to 2019, you'll find that there were 700,000 tons of maize produced. So we've gone almost below the initial number that I mentioned from 2014, which is 1.3 million. So by 2019, the Command Agriculture project had not produced as much maize as it had planned to. Now, here's the analysis around that. Number one, drought was a major factor in farming output in Zimbabwe more than anything else. The only year when Zimbabwe was import independent was 2017. That's also the only year where there was a good rainfall. Number two, farmers actually stopped participating in the Command Agriculture program because what happened at the same time was that the Zimbabwean currency was collapsing. So they didn't want to actually sell to the Grain Marketing Board and take a massive haircut. So just to put it in context, the unofficial rate that everybody uses right now to trade Zimbabwean dollars is 1:80 with the US dollar. That's the current rate on the black market where most people operate. When you transact with the government, they will trade with you at 1:25. So you are losing a significant amount of value when you trade with them. So a lot of people realize that, hang on, wait a minute. If I'm selling this internationally or by myself in US dollars, I'm making full amount of money. But if I sell back to the government, I only make a third of the money that I could have made, or even less, right? So a lot of farmers just opted out and they stopped participating. And another thing is that there was actually large scale corruption that meant that most of the 3 billion that was planned and allocated didn't eventually end up where it was supposed to go. So farmers didn't necessarily see this money. In fact, one of the guys who saw the money was a very close ally of Emmerson Mnangagwa, the current president. I'm going to tell you about him just now and tell you about some of the mess there. So the guy who made the most benefit from Command Agriculture was a gentleman called Kudakwashe Tagwirei. And he had a company called Secunda Holdings, which basically was supposed to be the company that is doing a lot of the delivery of the implements to the farmers all across the country. And now he has been able to use his government tender on Command Agriculture to become an oil magnate, a mining magnate, and also to buy 30% of one of the largest banks in Zimbabwe. So you tell me, after I've given you the numbers around the production output in Zimbabwe, do you really think Command Agriculture money went to the farmers or went to Secunda? Besides the corruption, which is endemic in many places in Africa, and also endemic to command systems, what we saw in Zimbabwe was also that farmers didn't always use the implements that they did get. They resold them on the black market for higher prices, because remember, the black market has more value than the government market. So if you get fuel at a government discount, you're actually going to be able to sell that very same fuel to the black market at 10 times, 20 times as much, because there's a shortage of fuel in Zimbabwe. So command agriculture fuel didn't end up going to tractors, it went back onto the streets. So the government plan was never going to work in a situation where there were other drivers pushing for demand for those same implements outside. So the farmers who had a farm basically gamed the system and made sure that they got money. So even if they never farmed, they still made a lot of money from getting farming equipment. And then they would do a tokenistic farming, of course, to say, look, what farming is the drought, etc., etc. But some of it was simply because they were not allocating the very same resources they got into farming. Number 5, at the end of it all, at the end of 2019, what government had then actually said was that they were changing the financial structure of command agriculture to include public and private partnerships involving banks, the private sector. When they said that, they were essentially admitting defeat. They were actually saying that this thing had failed. And if I give you some data from 2019, last year, there was a big drought in Zimbabwe. And what we observed when we analyzed that drought is that drought was a bigger factor towards crop production than actually command agriculture was. If there was rain, you get good crops. If there wasn't, you don't. But there's a human element to drought as well. There are human drivers to drought, and part of those come from neglect by the government. And the Zimbabwean government is very responsible for the loss of arable land and the harsh impact of drought in many of the places where the drought has been felt the most. But this is what happened last year. The World Food Programme said that 7.7 million Zimbabweans needed urgent food aid, and that the government, instead of having its strategic reserve of 500,000, actually was left with 100,000 tons of maize in their strategic grain reserve. And then 35,000 head of cattle were lost last year. And actually, what the World Bank and the World Food Programme were trying to get last year, they were trying to get an amount of $200 million so that they could feed 4 million people for 6 months. So I want you to think about that number for a second. The World Food Programme said, listen, in fact, it costs us 200 million every 6 months to feed 4 million. If we take those numbers and say, listen, we want to feed 8 million people, how much would we need a year? We would need 800 million. So to feed 8 million people, we would need 800 million. Remember that 3 billion that I spoke about that ended up in the hands of Secunda and other actors? If we had just taken that money and bought maize implements for the people of Zimbabwe would have been fed for 3 years. Over half of them would have been fed for 3 years by purely just importing grain. So the project of command agriculture was so inefficient that you would have been better off not doing it at all and simply importing grain from other countries. So if you had cancelled farming and just said, we're just going to buy grain, you would have saved a lot more money, and you wouldn't have had one particular individual becoming one of the most powerful actors in Zimbabwe and, strengthening an oppressive regime the way that it has happened without command agriculture. So what's the moral of the story in all of this? The moral of the story is that command agriculture didn't work in Soviet Russia, and command agriculture failed in Zimbabwe when they tried to implement it. That's because there are inherent inefficiencies of design in command systems, and that version of socialism where everything is centralized, when mixed with corruption, leads to perverse outcomes. That's not to say there's no value in trying to have redistributive economies. That's to say that in certain contexts, the last thing you want to do is to pursue a redistributive socialist structure, knowing full well that there are thugs running the state. So it didn't work in Zimbabwe. So now let's look at the polar opposite, the market economy. The polar alternative to the command system is the pure market system, or pure capitalism, or laissez-faire capitalism as it's called. And this system is characterized by certain key ideas that we're going to discuss. And the first idea that we need to discuss is the idea of private ownership of resources. So private ownership is all about individuals controlling owning, utilizing, and being able to transfer certain products. So this doesn't just extend to physical products. It also looks at intangible items. So we'll look at patents, rights, copyright, those kind of things. All of those things are all within the bracket of private ownership. So if you have private ownership, the idea is as people play the economic game, they can accumulate resources, transfer them as they see fit. So the individual is central to all of that. So that's number one. The second key idea comes from a philosopher called Adam Smith. So Adam Smith was an 18th century Scottish philosopher and economist, and he's popular within the modern economic school of thought because we are basically running the economic system that Adam Smith promulgated through his particular train of thought. So in his book, The Wealth of Nations, he makes reference to what he calls the invisible hand. So I'm going to read you a quote here from the book and then explain and unpack what actually Adam Smith stood for. Here's what he said. The rich consume little more than the poor, and in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, they divide with the poor the produce of all of their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions amongst all of its inhabitants. And thus, without intending it, without knowing it, they advance the interests of the society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. So basically what Adam Smith says in his invisible hand theory is that the way that you get maximum utility from the economic system is to leave private actors to act in their own selfish interests. And when they act in those selfish interests, the market will be optimized in such a way that everyone will benefit at the end. This is why sometimes you'll hear about trickle-down economics, because the idea is you're supposed to let the thing work and then the benefits will trickle down into the public in such a way it will be as if you had evenly split up everything and given it to the people as a government. So this is what leads to people saying that they want to have a small government, where the role of the government is to actually stay out of the economic affairs of man and to only deal with the economic affairs that are not in the direct interest of individuals to try to handle. So you will find that the concept of the role of the state, when you look at thinkers like Adam Smith, is as follows. Number one, they believe that government has this role, the role of defending the state from external attacks. So the government has to provide an army. Number two, they have the view that government has to provide law enforcement to maintain law and order so that the whole economic system can work, because you can't have economic transactions if there are thieves all over the place, etc. So defense and policing, these are things that market systems do prioritize. And then they also prioritize projects which are not necessarily for-profit projects or projects that can be done by individual self-interested actors. Rural electrification, sewer systems, public transport. These are things that are left into the hands of the government to provide. So the role of the government is stay out of it, stay out of the market as far as possible, but then build the roads, secure the borders, secure the city, and basically make sure the roads are functioning and then get out of the way. Obviously, there are other expectations for a government to be able to do. And another one of those is to set fair market standards. So the government is expected to set rules for how the market will operate, but those rules are supposed to be minimum interference rules. Everyone is supposed to be self-regulating as far as possible. And hidden in all of this is the idea, or two ideas, two coexisting ideas to the invisible hand theory. Number one, rationality. There is an idea here that actors within this particular system are rational and that they will act in ways that maximize their profit and minimize their effort. So the idea is when you have all of these rich self-interested actors, they're going to work in ways that maximize their profit, minimize their cost. So that's going to be an efficiency optimization, if you will. The second idea around this is that there will be competition. Because everyone is self-interested and working by themselves, those people will compete. In fact, capitalism is supposed to have as much perfect competition as possible so that the price goes down and the quality goes up. That's the idea. As more and more people are in the market trying to attract limited dollars, all of those people rationally will act in ways that will make their product more attractive than the other one. And as a result of that competition, you'll have innovation, you'll have advancement. This is the idea behind the market system. So when you are thinking of a market system, you have to think about not only the idea of the invisible hand, but accedent to that, the idea of the rational actor and the idea that the system works with competition. Unfortunately, though, when you analyze history, you realize that we've moved away from that kind of a system because of abuses that have existed as a result of following that particular system. So, one of the first things that we have to point out is that the whole economic design of a market economy is one that doesn't price in from the default position the cost to the environment. So what we saw is that as people are maximizing their profit and that they're minimizing their loss, one of the things that they're not factoring into their account ledgers is the cost to the environment of their actions. And that's why we've seen the kind of environmental problems we have right now, because everybody kept deferring the cost of the environmental preservation to the next generation. And guess what? We were left with the bill. And what does that bill look like from an Africa perspective? Last year, we saw some peculiar weather events which are all actually interconnected. Firstly, there were 2 cyclones that occurred in Mozambique early in the year. And then later in the year, there were massive floods that occurred in East Africa, which killed thousands of people, displaced millions of people, and actually ruined their crop and their food security. And then after that, we saw an influx of locusts in East Africa, locusts that were moving in kilometers upon kilometers, chowing all of the food, the crops, and actually making food security even lower. What do the cyclones, the floods, and the desert locusts all have in common? Indian Ocean dipole. The Indian Ocean dipole is as a result of global warming. That is one negative outcome that is existing as a result of the market calculus of a market system. Because all of the costs are not factored in, the environmental cost is one that we are now paying and not the people who've been benefiting from the kind of behaviors that they created where the environment would be compromised. So that's number one. Number 2 is inequality. We live in a world where we are facing the highest levels of inequality in some spaces that have ever been seen. So if you look at South Africa, it's the most unequal society in the world. America, one of the most unequal societies in the world. And these are systems where the market system has been prioritized over other versions of economic redistribution or economic organization. So the idea was that rich actors acting in their self-interest will act in ways such that that money will eventually end up in the hands of everyone, to the extent that it will look like, government had distributed that money themselves. This is the idea that Adam Smith is betting on, right? And he says that the rich consume little more than the poor. And in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, they divide with the poor the produce of all of their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions amongst all of its inhabitants. And thus, without intending it, they advance the interest of the society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. This has not been proven to be true in the real world, because what we saw is that the rich actually did consume a lot more than the poor, and they began a culture of consumption and accumulation where they would build more and more mansions, where they would actually expand their wealth and save their wealth, transfer their wealth, and the wealth didn't actually trickle down to the poor. That's why you still have, 25 years after apartheid ended, massive inequalities in a country such as South Africa, because the people who are living in the high-end suburbs of South Africa didn't necessarily redistribute that wealth to the townships of South Africa. So the townships remain in their condition and the suburbs remain in their condition. And in fact, the suburbs have become more developed, the distribution has not changed. And in fact, the suburbs have become more elite and affluent, while the townships have actually spiraled a little bit further into more poverty, not less. So the premise of the case is that we will have more fairness as a result of the invisible hand. The reality is we haven't seen as much fairness. Now, people have known for a while that laissez-faire economics doesn't work, which is why we saw, the introduction of labor unions, which is why we saw the introduction of competition law to make sure that monopolies are broken up and competition can actually happen. But what we've seen is that even this approach, where you have mixed economies, and we're going to talk about mixed economies just now, has not been effective. So in the real world, when you compare, you can obviously notice from our discussion that command economy doesn't work. You can obviously notice from our discussion that market economy doesn't actually produce what it promises to produce and has led to very, very serious harms in the environmental sector as well as in inequality. So then the question then becomes, how do we get to a functional and fair economic system? Many people have said, let's mix it. So in the mixed economy, what the government will do is they will provide social security nets. So you'll see that in South Africa with welfare programs, with educational support, with some free schools. The problem that exists in countries such as African ones, I'll discuss just now, but let's look at ones where they're not in an African context. The state will try to provide support for education, social security, and some of the countries that everyone loves to reference are the Nordic countries because they do that quite well. And the way that the state does that is through a progressive taxation system where they come in, they say, listen, how much are you earning? We're going to progressively tax you. So the more you earn, the more you pay in tax. And those tax dollars are then put into the government coffers, and the government then rolls out social programs which are meant to assist the poor. So South Africa has a version of that, and several other countries do. Even America has a mixed economy. So mixed economies are the standard. The question that then exists is, how mixed are they? Where do the mixed economies actually fall on the spectrum? Do they lean socialist or do they lean pure market? And depending on how they lean, you will have an impact in your particular society. But I want to point out something that complicates the discussion. Africa has also chosen mixed economies, but the mixed economies that they've chosen have been very brutally handicapped in their agenda by two problems. Number one, nepotism, which in South Africa we refer to as cadre deployment. Basically, the well-connected to politicians and to bureaucrats are able to get jobs at the expense of qualified and maybe potentially politically independent or politically opposed civilians. So you'll find that the ANC in South Africa believes that you need to find qualified members from the party to go into the strategic positions of bureaucracy to roll out the administration. The problem is they seldom send qualified members of the party. Those people never ascend to the positions where they can get the connections to get the job. So while they are qualified members of the ANC, those people seldom get the engineering contracts, the engineering jobs. The jobs are acquired by people who are more politically savvy, but those people are not necessarily technically qualified. So that's something that has manifested in different ways in different countries. Even if you think about African countries, you'll find that a lot of times people with the jobs need to know someone. In fact, knowing someone is one of the most important things you could actually have in South Africa and Africa. Political connections. If you don't, in Kenya, there's been massive discussions around how nepotism undercut the efficiency of the bureaucracy. The same can be said in Nigeria. The same can be said in Zimbabwe, in several other African countries. So nepotism and or cadre deployment have been a problem. Number two is corruption, massive corruption, looting through tender processes where people get contracts, they deliver a mediocre service, and then they basically rip off as much of the invoices they can into their personal coffers. So if you think about it, the theory that Adam Smith put into the society was individual selfish actors will act in ways where they maximize their profit They minimize their cost because of their rationality, etc., etc. But he never considered a system where the laws don't actually work to catch bad actors. So in Africa, even in the mixed system, you find that you've got people who are acting in these self-interested, self-motivated ways, and the system allows for that, but they are not necessarily going to be caught, because we know that in Africa, having corruption charges made is a very difficult thing to see, and then having convictions actually made is a very difficult thing to see. So you don't actually get the impact of deterrence that exists when a police system is functional, because in other countries which are more observant of the rule of law, if you are corrupt and you're caught fleecing tenders, you will go to prison. But if you don't go to prison, then there's no fear that exists in a corporate actor's agenda to actually make them think, hey, wait a minute, if I steal this money, I'm going to get arrested and go to jail for the rest of my life. So the mixed economy doesn't produce the outcome that it's supposed to, because hidden in its design is the problem that cannot be dealt with in Africa because of the political involvement in the affairs of the administration at the level of cadre deployment and nepotism, and also at the level of corruption and fleecing. So when you don't have a policing system that works, you end up with the worst outcomes for a mixed economy. So we've discussed mix in general. There's a specific example that I want to look at in terms of an economic system design, and that's called the social market economy. So we're going to discuss that. It is still within the realm of the mixed economy, but it's one model that I think needs pointing out and maybe a little bit more discussion so that we can think about how can Africa do that.